as smoke blanketed the sky and flames devoured the dry hills. Two leaders found themselves at odds. Dan Miller, with a lifetime of firefighting behind him, relied on intuition and grit. Alex Carter, fresh from military service, brought drones, data, and precision to the table. Their approaches couldn't have been more different. But the wildfire raging toward a vulnerable retirement home demanded one thing: unity. Could they find common ground before the inferno claimed more than just land? Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey tomorrow. The hum of the firehouse radio was as familiar to Dan Miller as the sound of his own breathing. After 30 years on the job, he knew every nuance of its static-laden broadcasts. Leaning back in his chair, he sipped his coffee, staring at the wall where photographs of past fires and crew members hung. Each picture told a story of sacrifice, courage, and the bond shared by those who ran toward danger when others fled. Dan's mind drifted to the first major fire he'd fought, a warehouse blaze that had threatened to engulf an entire block. He could still feel the heat, hear the roar of the flames, and recall the faces of his crew as they battled for hours. He had led that charge, relying on nothing but experience, instinct, and the unwavering trust of his team. 30 years, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. Retirement loomed, and though his body reminded him daily that it was time, his heart resisted. This job wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. Across town, Alex Carter sat in front of a bank of monitors at the Rescue Coordination Center. The screens displayed real-time maps of the wildfire, showing its rapid spread across dry terrain. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing thermal images of the blaze, while algorithms crunched data to predict its next move. Alex leaned forward, studying the red zones on the map. He tapped a few keys, zooming in on the fire's eastern edge, where several neighborhoods lay in its path. His jaw tightened. "Too close," he muttered, grabbing his radio. Years in the military had taught Alex the importance of precision. One misstep, one overlooked detail, could cost lives. He'd seen it happen, troops lost because the intel had been incomplete or outdated. He couldn't let that happen again. As the smoke thickened on the horizon, Alex felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Every plan he made, every directive he issued, carried the potential for both salvation and catastrophe. The video conference began with static before the images resolved into clarity. On one screen was Dana's weathered face lined with experience. On the other was Alex, younger but with eyes that betrayed a history of battles fought and lost. The fire's moving faster than expected. Alex began. His tone clipped. "Our drones indicate a shift in wind patterns. We need to adjust evacuation routes immediately." Dan crossed his arms. "We've got boots on the ground seeing this up close. Your drones might show one thing, but out there, it's a whole different picture." Alex bristled. "Those boots on the ground can't see through smoke or map out real-time changes like the technology can. And technology doesn't account for human error or unpredictable fire behavior." Dan countered. "I've been doing this long enough to know that instincts matter just as much, if not more, than your fancy equipment." The tension in the virtual room was palpable. Neither man was willing to back down. "Look," Alex said, his voice measured. "I respect your experience, but we're facing a fire unlike anything we've seen before. We need every tool at our disposal to stay ahead of it." Dan exhaled sharply. "Tools are only as good as the people using them. You can't rely on machines to make the tough calls out there." The meeting ended with no resolution. the wildfire looming as both men returned to their respective duties. By evening, the fire had consumed thousands of acres. Its path erratic and merciless. Reports from the field painted a grim picture, families scrambling to evacuate. Roads choked with traffic. And resources stretched thin. Dan stood with his crew, briefing them on the next steps. Despite his earlier frustrations, he couldn't ignore the fact that the situation was growing more complex. The younger firefighters looked to him for guidance, trusting his steady presence in the chaos. Meanwhile, at the coordination center, Alex reviewed the latest drone footage. He spotted a vulnerable pocket of homes at the fire's edge and felt a pang of urgency. Pulling up his radio, he relayed instructions to a nearby crew, hoping they'd act in time. The wildfire didn't care about experience or technology. It moved without reason, a force of nature defying control. Dan and Alex, separated by miles but united by the same mission, both felt the weight of what was at stake. They didn't have the luxury of agreeing on everything. But the fire didn't wait for consensus. For now, they worked their separate ways, each believing his approach was the right one. But as the flames crept closer and the stakes grew higher, both men would have to confront a hard truth. Survival demanded more than expertise or tools, it demanded unity. The wildfire roared through the hillside, devouring dry brush and leaving scorched earth in its wake. The air was thick with ash, and the horizon flickered with an ominous orange glow. Dan Miller, standing at the edge of a residential street, surveyed the chaos. His crew worked swiftly to cut fire breaks and soak the perimeter of homes. The sharp smell of smoke mixed with the sound of hoses spraying water and axes splitting wood. "We'll hold this line," Dan said, his voice steady despite the growing threat. He had been in situations like this before, fires that seemed unstoppable until grit and teamwork turned the tide. Nearby, Alex Carter monitored the same scene from the coordination center. The drone footage displayed on his monitors showed a different perspective, the fireline advancing faster than anticipated, threatening to engulf several homes within the hour. "Units on the ground. Be advised," Alex said into his headset. "Thermal imaging shows hotspots flaring up northeast of your position. Evacuate the adjacent block immediately." On the ground, Dan glanced at his outdated radio as Alex's voice crackled through. The static made the message barely comprehensible. He caught fragments, hotspots. Northeast. Evacuate, but not enough to act decisively. "Anyone make sense of that?" Dan asked, looking at his team. One firefighter shook his head. "Could be the wind shifting. Or not." Dan frowned. "We're staying put. We can't pull back based on a maybe." Unbeknownst to Dan, Alex had dispatched another crew to assist with evacuations in the area. The second team arrived just as the fire shifted, cutting off access to a small cul-de-sac. It was a close call. Families scrambled to safety, helped by the newly arrived crew. But the near miss left tensions high. Back at the coordination center, Alex slammed his hand on the desk. "We could have lost them," he said, frustration evident in his voice. A colleague placed a hand on his shoulder. "It wasn't your fault. They got out in time." "That's not good enough," Alex replied. "I've been here before, bad intel. Missed signals. And people pay the price. I can't let that happen again." The weight of his military past bore down on him. Alex remembered the mission that had gone wrong years ago, when a single miscalculation led to devastating consequences. Every decision he made now was shaped by that memory. Meanwhile, Dan stood with his crew, catching his breath after the evacuation. The realization that the fire had nearly outmaneuvered them gnawed at him. He thought of his father, a firefighter who had once been a local hero, and his grandfather, who had fought fires long before modern equipment. They had relied on instincts, on reading the wind and watching how flames moved. Was that enough anymore? Dan sighed and turned to his crew. We're not perfect, but we're still standing. Let's make sure the next neighborhood is too. As the day wore on, the divide between traditional methods and modern technology became increasingly evident. One of Dan's firefighters, a veteran named Greg, approached him during a break. "Cap, I know you're not sold on all this tech stuff," Greg said, "but that drone footage saved some people today. If we'd had it 10 years ago, think how many lives it could have saved." Dan looked at Greg, surprised. "You think we're doing it wrong?" "I think there's room for both," Greg said. "You've taught me more about firefighting than anyone. But even you've got to admit, times are changing." Dan nodded slowly. "Maybe. But instincts still count for something." "They do," Greg agreed. "But so does adapting. You're the best leader I've worked with because you know how to do both." That evening, Alex received updated fire maps showing a potential new fire front forming near a heavily populated area. He picked up the radio and hesitated before calling Dan. "Hey, Captain Miller. This is Carter," Alex began. "Got a minute?" Dan, sitting on the back of the fire truck, raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" "I wanted to say, your crew did good today," Alex said. "I know we've had our differences, but your call to hold the line probably saved those houses." Dan leaned back, surprised by the compliment. "Appreciate that. And your tech isn't half bad either. It gave us a heads up when we needed it most." The exchange was brief, but it planted a seed of mutual respect. The wildfire showed no signs of slowing. But for the first time, both men began to see the value in each other's approach. Dan reflected on his legacy, realizing that clinging to the old ways might not be enough to protect the next generation. Alex, meanwhile, acknowledged that no algorithm could replace the human instincts honed over decades in the field. The fire still raged, and there were hard days ahead. But as Dan and Alex prepared for what was to come, they began to understand that their combined strengths might just be what the community needed to survive. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel. It means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The wildfire had been unpredictable all day. But now, a sudden wind shift had turned chaos into calamity. Gusts sent embers flying, igniting dry brush faster than anyone could react. A rural neighborhood, thought to be out of the fire's immediate path, was now directly in its line of destruction. Dan Miller stood at the edge of the blaze, barking orders to his crew. "We've got less than an hour before it hits those houses. Focus on the fire breaks." From the coordination center, Alex Carter watched the fires advance on his monitors. The drone footage showed flames licking at the edges of the evacuation route, their usual exit now impassable. His stomach tightened. Dan Alex called through the radio, his voice steady despite the tension. "The primary route is blocked. I'm sending you new coordinates for an alternate escape path." Dan's radio crackled, the message fragmented by static. He caught route, blocked, and new coordinates. "Repeat that," Dan said, motioning for his team to pause. Alex repeated the directions, more deliberately this time. Dan frowned, scanning the area ahead. "Path looks steep," he said into the radio. "Is it clear?" "Drone shows it's your best option," Alex replied. "The terrain's rough, but it'll get you out." Dan turned to his crew. "We're moving. Follow me." As they reached the neighborhood, the urgency of the situation became clear. Smoke hung thick in the air, and the fire roared louder with each passing moment. Families scrambled to pack their belongings while others hesitated, unsure of where to go. "We've got to move these people now," Dan shouted. Nearby, a younger firefighter named Ethan approached Dan. "Captain, we've got 2 houses at the end of the block with no sign of movement. Could be people still inside." Dan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Take a partner and check." Quickly, back at the coordination center, Alex's drones captured the full extent of the fire's reach. He watched the monitors closely, his hands gripping the edge of the console. Dan, Alex said into the radio, "You've got a flare-up forming on your left flank. You'll need to steer clear." Dan glanced in the direction Alex described, his instincts confirming what the drone had spotted. "Copy that," Dan said. "Good catch." For the first time, there was no edge in his tone. Inside one of the houses, Ethan found an elderly couple frantically trying to gather their belongings. "Sir, ma'am, we need to go now," Ethan said firmly. "But we haven't finished packing," the woman protested, clutching a box of photographs. Ethan softened his tone. "I understand, but it's not safe here. We'll help you carry what you can, but we need to leave immediately." The couple finally relented, and Ethan guided them outside, where Dan was organizing the evacuees. "We're running out of time," Dan muttered under his breath. As the evacuation continued, Alex monitored the situation closely. His drone's thermal imaging revealed a new hotspot dangerously close to the alternate route. Dan, Alex called, "You've got fire spreading toward the exit point. You'll need to push through faster than planned." Dan's radio crackled, but the message was clear enough. He turned to his team. "Double time it. We're cutting it close." Navigating the rough terrain of the alternate route proved challenging. The steep incline and loose gravel made progress slow, and the evacuees were growing anxious. "Stay together," Dan called out. "We're almost there." Ethan jogged up beside him. "Cap, we've got a problem. One of the evacuees is struggling to keep up. We might need to carry her." Dan turned to see an older woman leaning heavily on her husband. Without hesitation, he moved to her side. "Ma'am, we're going to get you out of here," Dan said. "Ethan, grab her other side. Let's move." As they neared the clearing, the fire surged again, cutting dangerously close to their path. "Alex," Dan called through the radio, his voice strained. "We're losing the route." "I see it," Alex replied, his voice calm but firm. "Hold your position. I'm coordinating a water drop." Minutes felt like hours as Dan's team held their ground, shielding the evacuees from the encroaching flames. Finally, the sound of helicopters filled the air, and a rush of water doused the fire ahead. "Go now," Alex's voice urged through the radio. Dan didn't need to be told twice. "Move! Move! Move!" he shouted, guiding the group to safety. When the last evacuee stepped into the clear zone, Dan exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Nice work," Alex said through the radio. "You kept them calm and got them out." Dan glanced at his crew, then at the families now safe from harm. "Couldn't have done it without your assist," he admitted. As the team regrouped, Ethan approached Dan. "Cap, about earlier, if we didn't have those drones, we might not have made it. Guess the new stuff isn't so bad after all." Dan gave a small nod. "Maybe not." Back at the coordination center, Alex leaned back in his chair, the tension finally easing. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of respect for Dan's leadership. The neighborhood was safe. But the wildfire continued to rage. Both men knew the battle was far from over. Yet in that moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. Their combined strengths had made all the difference. As Alex prepared for the next challenge, he thought of Dan's instinctive decisions in the field. Meanwhile, Dan reflected on how Alex's technology had given them the edge they needed. The fire had tested them both, but it also began to bridge the divide between tradition and innovation. Together, they were stronger, and they would need to be for the fight ahead. The retirement home perched on the hillside was a serene sanctuary for its elderly residents until the wildfire threatened to turn it into a trap. Flames surged up the dry slopes faster than expected, embers raining down like fiery snow. Inside, staff scrambled to evacuate, but many residents were bedridden or wheelchair-bound, making escape slow and chaotic. Dan Miller arrived with his crew, his sharp eyes immediately assessing the situation. Thick smoke curled into the sky, and the fire crackled with alarming intensity. "Listen up," Dan barked. "We've got limited time. Split into pairs. Clear each wing. And get everyone to the buses. Move fast but stay calm." His team sprang into action, but the enormity of the task weighed heavily on him. Back at the coordination center, Alex Carter was glued to his monitors. The drone footage revealed how close the fire was to the building, with flare-ups igniting faster than anyone could predict. "Dan, we've got trouble," Alex said over the radio. "The winds shifted again, and the fire is pushing toward the southern side. You need to prioritize those residents." "Understood," Dan replied. "But we're stretched thin down here. Can you get me water drops on that side?" "I'm on it," Alex said, already coordinating with the helicopter crews. Inside the building, Dan moved methodically, his presence steady and reassuring. He entered a room where an elderly woman clung to her walker, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, ma'am," Dan said gently. "We're going to get you out of here." "Everything's happening so fast," she whispered. "I know," Dan said, helping her to her feet. "But you're safe with us." As Dan escorted her outside, the heat from the approaching fire was palpable. His radio crackled to life. "Dan, we've got a flare-up at the south entrance," one of his crew reported. Dan's stomach tightened. "Hold it off as long as you can. We'll clear this floor and be out in 10. At the coordination center, Alex monitored the situation, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The drone captured a sudden surge of flames near the south entrance, and Alex quickly redirected a helicopter to douse the area. "Dan, water drop coming in," Alex said. "You'll have a clear path. But it's going to be tight." Dan trusted Alex's judgment, a shift from their earlier tensions. "Copy that," he said, as the team evacuated the last residents. A younger firefighter named Ethan joined Dan, kept the south wings clear. "But the fire's closing in. We've got to move." "Not until everyone's accounted for," Dan said firmly. Ethan hesitated, then nodded, his trust in Dan evident. Outside, Alex watched the situation escalate in real time. The drone footage showed flames licking at the building's foundation, smoke obscuring the escape routes. "Dan, you've got about 5 minutes before that area's compromised," Alex warned. "Roger that," Dan replied. "We're almost out." The evacuation was nearly complete when a sudden explosion of flames roared through the south side. The blast shook the building, and Dan's heart sank. "Status report," Dan called into his radio. "Everyone's out except you and Ethan," came the reply. Dan turned to Ethan. "We've got to move. Now." At the coordination center, Alex's pulse quickened. The drone captured Dan and Ethan navigating through dense smoke, their path cut off by burning debris. Dan, hold your position, Alex said. I see a secondary exit route on the east side. Sending coordinates now. Dan squinted through the smoke, trusting Alex's guidance. Got it. Moving. As Dan and Ethan navigated the alternate route, the heat intensified. The air was suffocating, and visibility was almost zero. Stay low, Dan instructed Ethan, his voice steady despite the danger. Cap, we're not going to make it, Ethan said, panic creeping into his tone. Yes, we will, Dan said firmly. Keep moving. Alex tracked their progress, his focus razor sharp. The drone revealed another flare-up dangerously close to the escape route. Hold on, Alex said into the radio. I'm redirecting the helicopter for a water drop. Stay where you are. Seconds later, water cascaded over the flames, creating a temporary safe zone. Go now, Alex urged. Dan and Ethan pushed forward, emerging from the smoke into the clear zone. They collapsed onto the ground, coughing but alive. The scene outside was a mix of relief and exhaustion. Residents were safe. The fire temporarily held back, and the team regrouped. Alex arrived at the site, stepping out of his vehicle to check on Dan. You good? Alex asked, his voice softer than usual. Been better, Dan said, catching his breath. But yeah, we're good. Alex extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Dan took it. Nice work in there, Alex said. Couldn't have done it without your drones, Dan admitted. And I couldn't have done it without your instincts, Alex replied. As they stood together, the contrast between them seemed less important. Both had faced the same enemy and come out stronger for it. You know, Dan said, we might actually make a good team. Alex smirked. Don't let it go to your head. For the first time, they shared a laugh, the tension of the day momentarily lifting. The wildfire was far from over, but the success of the mission marked a turning point. Dan and Alex had learned to respect each other's strengths, realizing that leadership wasn't about being right, it was about working together. As the flames burned in the distance, the two men prepared for the battles yet to come, knowing they would face them as a united front. The fire had finally been contained. The acrid scent of smoke lingered in the air, and the charred landscape bore the scars of a hard-fought battle. Yet amidst the devastation, there was an undeniable sense of relief, a silent gratitude for the lives saved, and a determination to rebuild. Dan Miller stood on the edge of the fire zone, surveying the damage. The retirement home, though singed, still stood, a testament to the team's efforts. His gear was stained with soot, and his muscles ached, but the weight in his chest was lighter than it had been in days. Nearby, Alex Carter stepped out of his truck, carrying a folder filled with maps and reports. His normally sharp demeanor was softened by exhaustion, but his eyes reflected a quiet confidence. Hell of a job out there, Dan said, walking up to Alex. Alex nodded. Couldn't have done it without you. Dan smirked. Guess that makes us even. Over the next few days, the focus shifted from firefighting to recovery. The community had been battered but not broken. Neighbors came together to clear debris, distribute supplies, and share stories of survival. Dan and Alex played pivotal roles in these efforts. At a makeshift recovery center, Dan worked alongside his crew, organizing supplies and coordinating volunteers. He watched as younger firefighters stepped up, inspired by the resilience they'd witnessed during the fire. Captain Miller, one of the younger crew members, said, "You think we'll ever see something like that again?" Dan looked out at the charred remains of the hillside. "Fires like this are getting worse. But we'll be ready." The young firefighter hesitated. "I mean, how do you always know what to do?" Dan chuckled. "You don't always know. You just trust what you've learned and rely on the people around you. That's what makes the difference." Alex, meanwhile, used his tech expertise to assess the damage and propose improvements for future disaster responses. At a community meeting, he presented new strategies, blending data-driven planning with insights he'd gained from working alongside Dan. "Technology is a tool," Alex told the group, "but it's the people who make it work. We need both experience and innovation to protect this community." The room was filled with nods of agreement, including one from Dan, who stood at the back, arms crossed but clearly impressed. The community's gratitude was evident during a small ceremony held to honor the first responders. Residents gathered in the local park, now a hub of recovery efforts, to thank the firefighters and coordination teams. An elderly woman from the retirement home stepped forward, holding a bouquet of flowers. "To Captain Miller and Mr. Carter," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. "You saved our lives. We can never repay you, but we will never forget you." Dan and Alex exchanged a glance, humbled by the recognition. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, Dan and Alex sat on the tailgate of a fire truck, sharing a rare moment of quiet. "You know," Dan began, "I wasn't sure about all that tech at first. Thought it was just bells and whistles." Alex raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Dan shrugged. "Now I see it's the future. Doesn't mean we throw out the old ways, but it's a hell of a tool in the right hands." Alex smiled. "Coming from you, that means a lot." Dan looked at him thoughtfully. "And you're good at what you do. Don't doubt yourself so much. You've got instincts, whether you see it or not." Alex nodded, the words settling something inside him. "Thanks, Dan. That means a lot." 2. In the weeks that followed, both men embraced their new roles with renewed purpose. Dan began mentoring younger firefighters, sharing the knowledge he'd gained over decades while encouraging them to embrace innovation. His once skeptical stance on technology softened as he saw its potential to enhance, not replace, the human element of firefighting. Alex, for his part, took on a leadership role in modernizing emergency response protocols. He worked closely with Dan's team, integrating advanced tools while respecting the wisdom of seasoned firefighters. The two men didn't always agree, but their mutual respect had transformed their working relationship into a genuine partnership. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a meeting about post-fire recovery, Alex turned to Dan. "You ever think about what's next?" Alex asked. Dan chuckled. "Retirement. Supposedly. But I don't think I can just walk away. Too many stories left to tell. Too many people to teach." Alex nodded. "Makes sense. You're good at what you do." "And you?" Dan asked. Alex hesitated, then smiled. "For the first time in a long time, I think I know. Helping people, this community, it feels right." Dan clapped him on the shoulder. "You're doing good work, Alex. Keep at it." As they parted ways, both men carried the weight of what they'd endured but also the pride of what they'd accomplished. Dan reflected on how leadership wasn't about having all the answers, it was about listening, adapting, and trusting the people around you. Alex realized that courage wasn't just about taking action, it was about learning from others and finding strength in collaboration. The fire had tested them both, but it had also forged a bond that would endure. together. They had shown the community, and each other, that unity and leadership could overcome even the fiercest flames.
The fire tested them, but it also brought them together, proving that unity can overcome even the fiercest challenges. What lessons about leadership and teamwork stood out to you in this story? Share your thoughts and this story with others. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.